Good afternoon. In this video, I'm going to deal with the second part of Robert Breaker's defense of the Confederate flag and how he rewrites history. This is from the Memoirs of Robert E. Lee. On page 88, talks about what the issue of secession is about. He was against secession. He didn't believe secession was the right way to go. And you know, the North and South have many problems. But what he says about secession. He says here, as an American citizen, I take great pride in my country, her prosperity, and her institutions would defend any state if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than the dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. That's why he went to Fort Virginia, because he felt he was honor bound to do so. I hope, therefore, that all constitutional means will be exhausted before there was a resort to force, which there wasn't. Because the South had legitimate ways to deal with the issues they were facing, the tariff issue, things like that. The slavery issue was the problem. The issue was the expansion of slavery, because that was going to be stopped. The American people had said enough was enough. We're not going to expand slavery. We want it to die. Secession is nothing but revolution. See, that's what it is, and that's what he's comparing to the American Revolution. So the colonies didn't have a right to secede from Britain. They had to fight for it, likewise, and they showed their grievances, why we were going to war over this, and the same thing. The South wants to get up the idea that they have some right to secede. No, if they were being, and that, according to a Breaker, that's what's happening. Like there's a war, more than aggression, stuff like that. No, they just didn't like how things were going over an election, and therefore they said we're just gonna pull out, and therefore you can't do anything about it. It's a revolution. And the president has a responsibility and takes oath of office to enforce laws. And they were breaking the law. That's what this is about. Let's see. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation and surrounded with so many guards and securities, if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. So he's dividing, saying it's a Confederacy. But the point is, and he calls it a perpetual union. And read here, it was intended for perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble for the establishment of a government, not a compact which can only be resolved by revolution or the consent of all the people in convention assembled. It was a perpetual union. It was supposed to be be improvement on the Articles of Confederation, which is where the perpetual union was actually stated, and therefore it was not to be broken by secession. The idea of states just pulling out. That's what Robert Lee is talking about. It is idle talk to talk of secession. Anarchy would have been established and not a government by Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, or the other patriots of the Revolution. Okay, so that was Robert Lee's view on secession. There wasn't such a thing as secession. It was basically a thing where the Constitution was formed by perpetual union, which is a view of Lincoln, by the way. So this idea that people, I'm going to see what it says, people in West Point were given the idea that they had a right to, secession was some right for every state to pull out when they felt like a compact of states. It was a union. It was a union. And it wasn't, these weren't individual nations. They were never nations that could just pull out. So let's hear a little more nonsense from Robert Breaker. And his last started about 10 minutes in.
To them and tell them you have to give us your money. So the Civil War started. Now, do you know what happened?
Now, we already established the Morrill Act was passed because the Southerners had already left. They could have blocked it if they stayed in as the Senate. They had the power. They had a president who was pro-Southern. They had a Supreme Court. They had the Senate. They had still this representation in the Senate. They were not. They did not have a taxation without representation.
A lot of people to this day say the Civil War started with the shots in South Carolina. Actually, a couple months before, there were some shots over here in Pensacola, close to where I live. But that's a completely different story. Look that up on the internet for an interesting story, if you will. But out here in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, there was a fort named Fort Sumter. I've been there. I actually went to Fort Sumter. And it was interesting. I walked around and looked at everything. And it was interesting that when I was there, I read some of the plaques on the wall, and I found out the history of Fort Sumter. And through studying history, I found out the history of what started the Civil War.
He points to tariff. Well, that was how it started the Civil War.
And you know what started the Civil War? It was not because of black slaves.
Oh, yes, it was. The Confederates had ready to left. The Southerners had already left when Lincoln was elected. Some of the states had already seceded in the Deep South, and that's how the tariff got passed and was signed by a pro-Southern Democrat.
That was not the history of the Civil War. The history of the Civil War is, out here in Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, was a fort. And the North was occupying that fort.
It wasn't occupying, it was a federal fort. That means all the states have a right. This is federal property. This isn't their property. This is federal property. And southern states who had seceded were going in and confiscating federal property without compensating for them, which was paid by all the taxpayers in the country, not just the Southerners. This is federal property. And they were going and taking, and Buchanan was letting them take these arsenals and these armories and things like that, and just sitting by, well, we can't do anything. This is federal property. That's not Southern. That's not the property of the state.
And South Carolina seceded from the Union. And when they did...
Yeah, South Carolina left the Union in 1860, and they took the 2 senators with them, and that's why they couldn't block the Maryland Tariff Act.
They immediately sent out people to that fort and said, this is our sovereign soil.
It isn't their sovereign soil. It was federal property.
This is our sovereign state of South Carolina. It is time for you to leave and go back to Washington.
Nope. That's federal property, and you have no right to do anything about it. You have no right to do about it. And if you do anything about it, it's a revolution.
And the man in charge out there in that fort, who was a Yankee lover, if you will, or someone in favor of Lincoln, he said, I will leave.
Oh, favor of Lincoln. You mean favor of obeying the laws? Yeah, that's what he was, in favor of obeying the laws. He was a military man. He had an obligation to hold that fort. He was a military man.
In 30 days, but I have no food. The South, for 30 solid days straight, took to that fort and took to those Union soldiers something to eat every...
So what? They were blockading it. They were blockading the fort. That's why they brought them food, because they weren't allowing the northern ships to get through.
Day for 30 days. Talk about Southern hospitality.
Yeah, they were pointing cannons at him. Yeah, that's just Southern hospitality. They were pointing cannons at him, threatening to attack him.
Well, the guy that was in Fort Sumter swore that he would surrender the fort to the Southern people, which is their right, because it is their state.
It's not their property. It's not their property, it's federal property. All the taxpayers paid for that fort. Not just South Carolina.
To have back. But he knew secretly that Lincoln had sent an armada, if you will. He sent a lot of ships to come down to that harbor. You know?
Yeah, to take back to protect federal property.
Who was on those ships? Tax collectors. And he knew that they were coming, and he was sent a letter, hold that fort as long as you...
Yeah, they're supposed to pay your taxes. They were supposed to collect tariff dues. Acts like tax collectors were going inland, like, collecting the income tax. These were people that were going to collect the tariffs to enforce the tariff laws that were legally passed by the Congress.
We can until we can get there. And so for 30 days, the South was patiently waiting for them to fulfill their word and give them back their land. But they...
It's not their land. It's federal property.
...knew that ships had been sent from the north to land on their shore and excise from them a 48% tax.
Not from them. The tariff. The tariff was going to be enforced. Like every individual Southerner was going to be affected with they would actually go with income tax, something like that. No, this was a tariff that was going to be enforced.
So why was Fort Sumter shot upon by the South? Well, Jefferson Davis saw those ships coming, and he said that's an act of war.
No, it's not. No, it's not. The fact is that they had a right to go to that fort. It was an American fort, which was there to collect tariffs.
That is the war of northern aggression, an act of...
No, not northern aggression. The southern aggression by firing on the flag.
War by sending ships to come and steal money from the southern people.
Can you steal it? That was a law that was fairly passed, and it only got passed. It was signed by a pro-Southern president, and it was only passed because the South left the Union. The Southern senators walked out of the Senate when they could have blocked it, and because they were mad over Lincoln getting elected.
So upon the 30th day, they waited for the man in Fort Sumter to surrender the fort, and he did not. And they said, okay, prepare to be fired on. They even gave him warning.
Gee, how nice of them.
Nobody died in the shooting at Fort Sumter except one man. And that poor one man was standing a little too close to a powder keg that blew up. So he wasn't even killed by Southern bullets or cannonballs.
Well, it doesn't matter. They're still firing on him, and they forced him to surrender and pull their flag down.
He was killed by being a little too close to a keg that exploded. So then they left. And then the North began to attack the South.
In Lincoln's inaugural address, he urged the South not to continue what they were doing. He said, "We can deal with this. We can compromise. I'm going to respect the Constitution. I am not going to violate the Constitution." But he says, "I cannot allow you to violate the Constitution." But they ignored that. And they underestimated the Northern men. They underestimated. The Southern men were so arrogant. They figured one Southerner could beat 10 Yankees. And their attitude was, we can't lose this war. We can't lose. And their stocks, odds were stacked against them. The northern states were industrial. They could rearm. They could accomplish way and have the numbers. But the Southern arrogance of Southerns, it was just like, we can't lose. We're not going to lose. We can't, we can't get beaten. And that was a fatal flaw in their fight. Now, they were great fighters, no question about it, and great, and their leadership was fantastic. But there's no way they're going to win that. And the fact was that the Northerners were going to fight just as hard as the Southerners, and that's exactly what happened. That's why this war ended up being so bloody.
And this war was all over a tax. You see, this.
Now, the war wasn't over a tax. You keep throwing out that lie. You talk about the big lie. It wasn't over a tax. It was over slavery. That's why the Southern states of the left, when Lincoln got elected, they weren't going to put up with Lincoln get the inauguration of Lincoln. We see the same garbage with these anti-Trump people. The fanaticism anti-Trump. They can't believe he's actually elected president. It's the same attitude.
Right here represents pretty much the same exact thing that the colonists fought against.
No, they did not. Because they had representation. They just walked out of Congress because they couldn't stand the election of Lincoln. And that's how that bill got passed. Don't let history, the facts of history stop you from telling a nice story.
No taxation without representation. The South had no representation.
You did have representation. The Senate left. The senators left the Congress. That's how it got passed.
Representation in Congress to vote against a 40-some% tax on everything they had.
It's a tariff. That's a tariff, and would have raised prices, would have raised prices in North. No one would argue about the issue of tariffs, but the point was it was legally passed, according to the Constitution. There's nothing illegal or immoral how it was passed.
So the whole thing was a repeat of what happened in the American Revolution.
No, it wasn't. No, it was not, because you had representation. You had constitutional ways of dealing with the issues. But you chose not to, the South chose not to, and that's why they left, because they were not going to accept the limitation of slavery, the growth of slavery. This guy is such a liar. Oh my goodness gracious.
The American Revolution was fought over, hey, you can't tax us. What we have is...
You see, when the American Revolution happened, there was Declaration of Independence that laid out the reasons for the grievances. Because we said, well, look, we understand that revolution is a very serious thing that accomplishes. The South never laid out their grievances. Oh yeah, after the war they laid out a bunch of grievances. They never laid out they had no right to revolution. They knew it.
Harsh. And then the North said, we're going to tax you 48%. The moral tariff. Better call it the immoral tariff.
Nothing to do with the tariff. Tariff is a big issue that was brought up after when they tried to get rid of slavery and make the issue of economic issue, when it was not.
So the war began. There was fighting. There was fighting left and right, and this flag was eventually adopted. There were several that were before this. This flag, what is this flag? Well, it's a battle flag. What is the battle for? To fight. To fight for what? Well, the Southerners viewed what Lincoln did as an act of aggression.
And they won't. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of enforcing law. It's an act of enforcing of legitimate laws.
Even during that time, all over Europe, Europe said, why are they so aggressively attacking the South?
No European country recognized the Confederacy except one, the Vatican. One country recognized the South, the Vatican. None of the European countries recognized the South as a legitimate country, as a legitimate set of nations. None of them. And the British, who were sympathetic to the South as a nation, the British people were sympathetic to the North and ending slavery.
It's done nothing wrong. And the North attacked, and a lot of people call it the Civil War. It should be called the Uncivil War. There's a good book out there called The Uncivil War by Leonard Scruggs that gives a good illustration of what the war was all about and what truly happened. There's also a pamphlet by another man named Scruggs called The Uncivil War. You need to look it up online and get the true facts.
Yeah. If you get any of the facts like this, you see nothing but lies, distortions.
About the Uncivil War. But the North today calls it the War of Rebellion. And they say this.
It was a rebellion. Exactly. It wasn't a war of secession because you can't secede. That's like, as Robert Lee pointed out. It's not just saying secession. It's rebellion. You might have a right to rebel if the grievances are large enough, if your individual freedom is at stake. But if not, then it's illegitimate rebellion.
The South rebelled against the North. How can you rebel when it's your right to leave the Union under the...
There's no right to leave the Union. There's no right for secession any. No country is going to put the right to secession. The Confederate Constitution doesn't have a right to secession in their own Constitution.
Constitution that they set up. And there's a good book called The Southern View on the Invasion of the Southern States. What that war should be called, the Civil War, is the War of Northern Aggression. Because the North fought to subjugate the South and force them.
They fought to bring the South back into the Union. And when they won the war, they didn't subjugate the South. They brought them into the Union. Once they agreed to loyalty and recognizing the Union as the nation as one, they were allowed their full rights back in there. And that's what they, the whole idea of reconstruction, that issue, bringing them back putting them back into the United States Congress and that type of thing for representation.
Them to pay a tax. Now, when you see in the historical view what that flag represents, whew, I don't see hate there. I see, hey, freedom from tyranny. I see the same reason we fought against Britain in the American Revolution.
According to the American Revolution, the principles of the American Revolution, the ones who had the right to rebel were the slaves. Not the Confederates, not the South. The ones who had the right, who were denied the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, according to the American Declaration of Independence, were not the whites of the South. It was the slaves who had a right to rebel.
It's no taxation without representation. It's free.
You were represented, you liar. You were represented.
Dumb. Leave me alone and quit trying to steal my money.
You liar. It wasn't about stealing your money. It was about keeping the slaves, because that was their money. The slave owners didn't want to lose their quote-unquote property.
Well, that's what this war was all about. You say, nope, it was all about slavery. Really? When about 5% of the people in the South owned slaves?
Yeah, and they controlled the South. The slave owners had the money, and they controlled the South. Politically. They politically controlled the South.
Yeah, there might be a little element of some slavery involved.
A little element. A little element. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This guy, read what the vice president said about what the issue was in the American Revolution. I'll get that document and show you exactly what he said. He said it was about slavery and what the issue was, going against the Declaration of Independence. So a document they said was totally bogus. He says the equality of man, he totally rejected it. And that's what the war was about.
And where does that come in play? Well, here's what happened. During the Uncivil War, the War of Northern Aggression, if you will, it went on for 4 long years. And what happened? Yeah,
unfortunately, a lot of men died for nothing over that war because the South refused to give up something they should have been given up peacefully.
Was in the North, Abraham Lincoln, which by the way...
Oh, by the way, he says in his article, he writes something down at the bottom there talking about how slavery would eventually end. Not according to the South. They were planning to expand it. Oh, it would have ended peacefully. That's another lie they put in. It would have ended peacefully. The South was not going to end slavery peacefully. It had too much money invested in it. That's why they were going to leave, and that's why they were expanding it. They wanted to expand it in different areas, even go to Cuba with it.
It was a dictator or a despot.
It was duly elected president. He was not a dictator or despot. The liar.
You say, no, wasn't he the good guy? We'll get to that in a second. But you go to Maryland. The national state song of Maryland says the words, thy despots heel
Yeah, post-slavery state, border state.
is upon thy shore, O Maryland. The state
Like I get I'm supposed to get the truth from Maryland. I can care what Maryland says about anything.
song of the state of Maryland calls Abraham Lincoln a despot. To the
Oh, it must be right then. If Maryland calls Lincoln a despot, it must be right. How can Maryland be wrong?
this day, a lot of people forget that Abraham Lincoln was called a tyrant.
He was told a tyrant by people who don't like the fact he was enforcing the laws. That's why he was called a tyrant.
Now, what happened? Abraham Lincoln wrote an edict from his hand, and it's called the Emancipation Proclamation. But did you know the Emancipation Emancipation, I can get it out in a second, barely say it. Did you know the Emancipation Proclamation was put out by Lincoln, in which he said all the slaves in the South are free? Now, how could he do that?
It was a war issue, and that's what he said. He says those states who were in rebellion were going to lose the right to use slaves in the war effort. That's why he could free slaves to go enslave, and he didn't free the border slaves because they weren't in rebellion. He tried to get those border states to end slavery peacefully. So look, slavery is going to end. So you guys better give up the slaves now. They refused, those border states. But he says, look, we're not going to allow the South to use these slaves against us in the war, and therefore he freed the slaves based on that. Where American armies were, Union armies were, slaves would be freed. And yeah, these slaves who were so happy being slaves, they ran to Northern armies. They ran to get freedom.
They're two sovereign countries, two different countries.
No, they're not two sovereign countries. That's the whole point of the war. That's the whole point of the war. They aren't two sovereign countries. The South was still part of America, and they were in rebellion, and they were going to be brought back into the country as one nation again.
This country went away from this country. How?
No, it didn't. It tried to. It basically said it could, but it can't. It was in rebellion and violating the laws, the federal laws.
Can a dictator in one country try to write a law?
He's no dictator. He's a duly elected president of the United States enforcing federal law.
To a completely different country. What if I was the president? Oh, God, no.
I mean, there were pro-union people in the South who didn't want to break away from the North. They don't talk about that. How they were kept down and kept out of the issue, and they were attacked. They were attacked by the Confederates as traitors to the Confederacy because they were pro-union.
I wouldn't take the demotion, no thank you. But what if I was the president of the United States of America and I wrote an executive order that everybody in Mexico had to do this and so? Wouldn't that be ridiculous?
Well, Mexico is a sovereign country. The South wasn't a sovereign country. They were in rebellion, and therefore they didn't have a right to rebellion, and therefore they were not considered a sovereign country.
Well, that's the equivalent of what took place in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, the president of a foreign country, wrote a piece...
It's not a foreign country. It's the United States of America. And the South, they were brought back as part of the United States of America, not as a foreign country.
The paper that said all slaves and all Negroes are hereby emancipated, but then watch this, it says in the southern states.
Yeah, and rebellion. The ones that were in rebellion. As part of a war aspect, because they were at war, so therefore in rebellion, therefore those slaves could be freed, and because they were considered, hey, confiscation of quote-unquote property.
No slaves were emancipated in the northern states. As a matter of fact...
Yeah, because they weren't at war. The border states, that's right, they were allowed to retain their slaves, like Delaware, Maryland, these states had slavery in there, Kentucky. They were allowed to keep those slaves because they weren't in rebellion. But Lincoln warned them, he says, this is going to end, the slavery is going to end, so you better do something with slavery now. But they wouldn't. They refused to do it. That's how entrenched slavery was. He even offered to pay them to free their slaves, and they refused.
If you study history, you find out something interesting.
This guy doesn't know history.
Did you know that after the Civil War, when General Ulysses S. Grant was president in the United States of America, I guess this would be 1870s, 1880s, I don't remember the date exactly, but Ulysses S. Grant, when he was the president in Washington, D.C., he had slaves.
You're a liar. You were right. Slavery was outlawed. Lincoln, Grant had a slave. Here's the early life of slavery. He said, during this time, this is about 1854. During this time, Grant also acquired a slave from Julia's father, a 35-year-old man named William Jones. Having met with no success farming, the Grants left the farm when their fourth and final child was born in 1858. Grant freed his slave in 1859 instead of selling him, at a time when slaves commanded a high price and Grant needed money badly. So he didn't sell him, he let him go, even though he would have gotten more money. There were no slaves in the White House after Lincoln because there was no slavery. There was no slavery. Slavery was illegal.
After the Civil War. You see, they say, this flag represents the South.
I mean, he doesn't give any proof of any of this. Where is the proof that there was slavery, people were slaves after the Civil War, when slavery was made illegal, and yet they're still going to push the idea that there was a slavery?
And they say this flag represents hate and slavery. This flag represents hate and it represents the South? What? When?
Okay, I'm going to stop it here, and we'll move on in the next video, dealing with more lies by this guy. Thank you. Amen.